Good afternoon, everyone. I am Dr. Yolanda Savoy, Chair of the African American History Committee at Coppin State University. We are excited to partner with the Pratt Library for a truly visionary dialogue during Black History Month. We are joined today by two giants in the field of Black history and narrative building. First, Dr. Jarvis Givens, the brilliant author of the new book, I'll Make Me a World, the 100-year journey of Black History Month. Joining him in conversation is Dr. K. Wise Whitehead, known to many as the host of Today with Dr. K on WEAA 88.9 FM, but who also serves as the president of ASALA, the very organization founded by the father of Black history, Dr. Carter G. Woodson. The significance of this gathering cannot be overstated by discussing this 100-year journey. We aren't just looking at a calendar, we are looking at a century of resistance and the intentional construction of a Black educational world. We are looking at how we reclaim our past in order to secure our future. And so, to open this amazing dialogue and ground us, I want to pose this question to both of you, as it seems to sit at the very intersection of your work, Dr. Givens, and your leadership, Dr. Whitehead. What does it mean to make a world when the world you inhabit was never designed to hold you?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I just have to say thank you, uh, Dr. Savoy, for that thoughtful introduction and for bringing us here today and for posing that beautiful question. And before I answer that, because I actually want to take a moment to think about the title of the book and saying that, but also just want to say I'm super excited for this conversation with Dr. Whitehead. I couldn't think of a better conversation partner than you, especially given your leadership of Asala right now. I've learned so much from Asala. I've benefited so much from the time I was a student in Asala. So being able to kind of write this book and to be in conversation with you on the publication date, right? Because the book is just kind of like coming out into the world today. It's officially released today is truly an honor. But to that question, I, you know, I think one of the things in terms like what it means to make a world in a world that was not created to hold you, I think is to look at the tradition that Negro History Week and Black History Month emerged from, which is the rich intellectual and organizing traditions that Black communities were engaging in, well before Negro History Week began, but that Carter G. Woodson formalized with the establishment of Negro History Week and with founding ASALA in 1915. So it means kind of developing the resources, the intellectual resources, the institutional resources to help build a life for oneself to where you can kind of live a dignified life and pursue beauty and pursue justice despite the external hostilities of the world you live in. And I think about and also create beautiful materials and resources for living and beautiful equipment for living, like poems, like the creation by James Weldon Johnson, right? That the title of the book comes from, I'll Make Me a World. I loved reading all of these narratives of generations of Black youth learning the poem, The Creation, in schools where they were performing for Negro History Week celebrations and talking about the emphasis their teachers always required them to say on that line in the first stanza, I'll make me a world, right? I think that poem by Johnson, Negro History Week, the stories that were created and recovered by people like Woodson are the things that we do to kind of make life livable despite the external hostilities that we experience, but also keeping an eye towards building something much better, something much more justice oriented and centered around justice, and something much more beautiful. I think that's what the tradition of Negro History Week and Black History Month has been about. It's been about thinking about the past, but always with an eye towards what it means to imagine a more free and more beautiful future.
I love that. And I am also excited to be in conversation with you, having followed your work as someone who co-labored with you on the Asala EC, and of course, the brilliant work you're doing at Harvard to uplift who we are, how we study and learn about our work in the tradition of Dr. Carter G. Woodson. So I thank you for that. I'm going to do something a little bit different at the top, where I'm going to actually answer the question, and then I want to get into your work, right? Because the whole goal today is to celebrate the birthday of I'll Make Me a World, but we're here on day 3 of Black History Month. And so in thinking about what Dr. Savoy put out, you thought about James Weldon Johnson, of course. I immediately thought about Langston Hughes and his 1935 poem, Let America Be America Again. That was published, of course, in 1936 in Esquire magazine. But there's a line that stuck out to me where he writes, "There's never been equality for me nor freedom in this homeland of the free." Given the fact that we've never had freedom in this country, we've never experienced true equality in a country that does not even know how to define equality nor sit with it. We've never really wrestled completely for what it means to build a diverse world. We haven't even wrestled what it means to have a democracy in this country. So all we've been doing is battling forward while being pushed back. What gets me when I thought about Langston Hughes, I immediately thought about my father being angry in 2004 when that title, Let America Be America Again, was picked up by John Kerry as a presidential campaign slogan. Like, how do you take the wrestlings around Let America Be America Again by Black people trying to figure out what this country means to us as folks who are in a hostile territory and turn that into like a white man's presidential campaign slogan, right? It's the cooptation of our culture, of our history, of our words, and of our language that to me underscore what it means to make a world within a system that wants to deprive you of all of your rights and all of your liberties, which of course naturally leads into I'll Make Me a World, which I have in front of me, the 100-year journey of Black History Month. I love the fact that we're doing this during, of course, Black History, but we just kicked it off. So why don't we start there? Because both of us are scholars of Dr. Woodson, and we both sit in the house of Woodson. But I don't think people really understand the direct connection that Woodson had to knowledge as a project. It wasn't just about creating Negro History Week as just kind of a side or a celebration. It wasn't just about the creation and establishment of a sala that he did in 1915 in Chicago with other scholars. It's about trying to build a bridge between what is happening in the academy and what is supposed to happen in our community when people grab hold of their history. So can you ground us first and kind of take us back to 1926 and then stretch it forward to help us understand why this century moment is not a century of the celebration of Black history, because we had been doing that before 1926, but around the ways in which he put structure around this time.
Yeah, I love that question, because I am always interested in, talking about the historical access to this historical narratives that people like Woodson and others made possible, but also looking to the actual labor into building the kind of world of knowledge that the Journal of Negro History and that the ASNLH was able to create at a time when Black scholars did not have spaces to kind of go to kind of build and share intellectual ideas in the American Academy or any other kind of academy that was established at that particular time. So in building these institutions, Woodson was it was a practice of world making around knowledge that had been kind of condemned and excluded from other parts of the academy. And it was not just speaking back to it to fill in those gaps, but also to offer a more transformed understanding of knowledge and a transformed understanding of history that was not just adding to something that was there, but that was a critique of what was in the mainstream kind of the academy at the time. And I think that Woodson's biography is really important here, even before we get to 1926, because for me, one of the beautiful things that I always like to emphasize about Woodson's intellectual trajectory is that Woodson was the child and student of formerly enslaved people. He didn't get to high school and graduate from high school until he was 20 years old. But that's not his introduction to history and meaningful knowledge about the past was not delayed until he went to the University of Chicago or to Harvard, even though it's important to recognize those accomplishments that he made. But he had the confidence cultivated with him by being the child and student of formerly enslaved people who orally taught him and passed on information about what they had seen, what they had lived through. And then when, his first teacher being his formerly enslaved uncles is one of the things that I often emphasize when I talk about him as a student before he himself becomes a teacher. But then we know Woodson, he goes to a high school called Frederick Douglass High School in Huntington,
Yes.
West Virginia. The naming of the school, even if the formal curriculum of schools in Virginia and West Virginia at the time did not formally endorse Black history, we know the way that Black people organized, and we know the way that they passed on knowledge. And the naming of that school that he attended, I think, betrays and exposes the kind of intellectual traditions that his cousin, who was the principal, was likely sharing with students that were there, right? Woodson also witnessed that same principal, who was his cousin, fired from that very high school because of the intellectual work that he was doing through a local published newspaper, right? He's fired in 1900, years after Woodson graduated from that school. But Woodson had been seeing these things. He worked in the coal mines with illiterate Civil War veterans, but men who he understood to be carriers of important stories and important knowledge, because they paid him in the evenings after working in the coal mines to read from books in newspapers. And they spoke back to those written texts, giving Woodson access to information and knowledge about the past that could have been lost to history. And so then when he gets to a place like Harvard and his teachers and professors say there's no such thing as Negro history, or at least none worthy of respect, he had already been kind of socialized and kind of raised up in a tradition that positioned him to be able to speak back and to think beyond the constraints of something like the field of history as it was constituted at a place like Harvard or a place like the University of Chicago, right? And so when he founds the association in 1915 on a public school teacher's salary, right? He's working in a world with other Black teachers who are also engaged in this intellectual struggle. And he starts to do more than just participate in that, but like you said, he starts institution building. He starts building and creating space for people to come together, these networks that are formed despite their kind of exclusion from the mainstream academy, and creating not just a Black version of the American Academy, but something new entirely, right? That's not just about the production of knowledge for the sake of producing knowledge, but producing knowledge to be prescriptive in response to the kind of social dilemmas that impacted the material conditions of Black life, right? And that's the tradition that Woodson was working in. And when he creates Negro History Week in 1926, one story that I always tell my students, there's an article from the Baltimore Afro-American newspaper that I always share with students, that it's in August 1st, 1925. The headline reads, "Dr. Woodson's Negro History Confiscated." And it's a story in 1925 about a segregated Black high school in Muskogee, Oklahoma, that was using the Negro in our history, that Carter G. Woodson wrote his textbook. The white school board decided to inspect this textbook after learning about it. After they inspected it, the books were confiscated, the teachers were reprimanded, and the life of the principal was threatened, and he was forced to resign, right? That's the intellectual context and the kind of hostility that Woodson, Mary McLeod Bethune, all of these important Black scholars were operating in when Negro History Week emerges for the first time in February in 1926. And we would see iterations of this kind of backlash and these kinds of restraints imposed on Black knowledge all throughout the 100-year journey, right? And certainly today.
I'm glad you said that, because I think that people don't understand or have not studied where Woodson fits in to that time period. You think about that time period and you talk about Du Bois, and you talk about, the back and forth with Booker T. Washington. You talk about how William Trotter was in the center of that through his newspaper, clearly making sure that people are holding Booker T. Washington accountable for the ways in which William Trotter said he was selling out the community, that forced W.B. Du Bois to later take a stand on the side of Trotter after he was arrested. I encourage people to go and get that story, because it's fascinating. All of this was happening while Woodson was institution building, not just through Asala which is now, of course, the longest serving organization dedicated to really protecting, promoting, and preserving our history, but also through the textual lineage. So I want to talk a bit about that even before we delve too much farther into the book, because I do think people need to understand, what did it mean for Woodson to launch the Journal of Negro History, which of course now is a Journal of African American History, only a year after he founded the SALA. He went on to then launch the Negro History Bulletin, which is now the Black History Bulletin, which is really set aside for teachers and parents. He was looking to make Black history, the pursuit of knowledge as a liberation project, available for anybody, no matter what your level of schooling is, from the coal miners to the professors.
Absolutely. And I think, one of the lines I remember reading The Miseducation of the Negro in a Black student kind of organization that I was in undergrad, where it was required reading, before I got to graduate school, and the line in The Miseducation of the Negro, when Woodson says there would be no lynching if it did not start in the schoolroom.
Yes.
Right. Where Woodson always understood that there was a relationship between the condemnation of Black life in the social and lived world, and that was connected to the way in which Black life had been condemned in the literary world, in the construction of knowledge, in the quote unquote canons of knowledge, history, literature, so on and so forth. So it's not, he was institution building, not just because he was very interested in the facts and dates of history, right? He was particular in a kind of a historian's historian in that way, but he always understood the work that he was doing, thinking against the grain, writing against the grain, creating kind of this new record, this new account of Black life and of the world, and that included Black life, as a way of trying to disrupt the kind of violence and anti-Black, the kind of anti-Black violence that Black folks were subjected to at the hands of mob violence, at the hands of the kind of inequitable access to kind of meaningful educational opportunities, healthcare, so on and so forth. He made these connections very clear, and it was a philosophical claim that he's making there that was very much ahead of its time, right? But that's how we understand that. That's how we have to understand and read the kind of urgency with which he's kind of trying to produce the Journal of Negro History, all of these textbooks, and also inviting younger, newer generations of scholars to be a part of this project as well, because he understood it not just producing knowledge for knowledge's sake, but it was about the way in which the kind of textual world and the literary world was also connected to the kind of social world that we lived in as well, and how ideas reflected in literature and in history shaped the kind of socialization of students going through school and became expressed through human behavior, right? When we think about mob violence and lynching and so on and so forth, or in the kind of intracommunal violence also that he was concerned about even within Black communities as well, right? These are the sort of things that him and other educators, whether it be Nannie Helen Burroughs, who was really committed, and even if she was not a professionally trained historian, in the book, I'm interested in pulling all of these important Black memory workers in conversation, because they were part of this broader kind of intellectual tradition around historical preservation, study, and teaching. And Woodson was right there alongside them, creating an institution that many of them were able to kind of come to and publish in, right? Mary Church Terrell was a teacher, published in the very first issue of the Journal of Negro History, right? So many educators were really helpful and sustain, and I'm saying educators, I'm thinking specifically like public school teachers as well, are a part of this story of like reclaiming and rewriting these histories.
And that's the part of Woodson that I like to emphasize, that when people talk and often say, second Black person to receive a PhD from Harvard, which means you're setting him kind of in the stratosphere with the Du Bois, right? Which feels very removed from the real work that Woodson was involved in, which was as a public school teacher. I mean, Woodson was uniquely concerned about making sure that education was effectively taught to the youngest of the young. And you just don't meet it when you get to college. It should be met with you as soon as you get into school. I want to go deeper into what the book lays out in terms of this journey of Black History Month that people don't understand, and they will in reading your book, was not just a simple journey. Like, it has been a struggle to say we stand here at a century, whether it was over the terminology, Negro to Black, whether it was over a week to a month, and whether it's over this point where I want to start this conversation with you kind of helping people to understand that Black History Month does not exist because the White House proclaims it. Like
Yes.
they don't give us Black History Month. And I
Yeah.
say that because I think that that is one of the myths about Black history, that just turning that myth alone removes the agency from Woodson and other Black folks who were already celebrating these moments.
Every time I hear that statement, and even before I came to Asala as an early graduate student for the first time, but like something about it just never seemed right. That kind of backhanded comment, that we got the shortest month of the year, and it's like, well, if you know anything about the kind of like just the basic fundamentals about the origins of like how Black History Month came to be, started as Negro History Week, it's like that we weren't given anything. And in doing that and in making that comment, it completely erases the labor of people like Woodson, of people like Mary Church Terrell, who introduced formally the celebration of Douglas Day in 1897, 2 years after Douglas died, because she recognized he was flagrantly absent in all of the school curriculum, despite how prolific he was as a writer, how influential he was in the 19th century, right? And so Mary Church Terrell, like other educators, made sure to introduce kind of Black students to important Black figures and created this commemorative holiday around Douglas Day. And so Woodson intentionally chooses, the week in February that he chooses for very particular reasons. So when we say we got the shortest month of the year, you're implying that it was given to Black folks as opposed to the result of ongoing grassroots labor and organizing around this work, right? I can think of even before Mary Church Terrell, I remember, reading the diaries of Charlotte Fortin during the Civil War when she's teaching, recently emancipated Black youth on the South Carolina Sea Islands. In her diary, she write about, she's teaching from these primers that are being sent from the missionary associations, but she says, I'm intentional to make sure that they know about Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian Revolution. And I'm teaching them the Song of John Brown, right? Because she's saying that I'm giving them something that they can understand themselves in relationship to history and to think about themselves as having a kind of a culture and a heritage that's also worthy of study. That's the tradition that Woodson and Mary Church Terrell and all these other folks that we've named were a part of. So absolutely, I felt like that was one of the things I wanted to do early on, was to try to disrupt some of these myths that people say in a very backhanded way. So oftentimes, these are people who are advocates of Black history and the teaching of Black history, and saying that, and exposing their ignorance really about the kind of genealogy of the tradition. And I'm not saying of any fault of their own. I think this also exposes the fact that every school across the country has some version of a Black History Month program. Some of them are pitiful. Some people are still doing really good work around Black History Month, right? Asala, other educators in community who have been grounded in these traditions. But it exposes the fact that everyone through every year of life have observed Black History Month, but haven't been taught effectively about the origins of how it came to be when they make those sort of comments. And I was recently reading a national poll about Black history education that said that less than 8% of this national sampling from the United States, of thousands of people, if they were asked various historical figures, if you learned, a lot about them, a little about them, heard their name or not much at all, less than 8% of the folks said that they had learned anything meaningful about Carter G. Woodson in school. And the name recognition was so low. And that exposes, again, the fact that even if people have been observing Black History Month, they haven't been teaching honestly about the political origins of it, because you can't talk about that without talking about Carter G. Woodson's own biography and his relationship to this point you're making about Black knowledge production in community struggle.
I add to that, thinking about even as early as 1865, when Black folks in Texas were celebrating Decoration Day, that later became Memorial Day. We were celebrating ourselves. And if that is just the one lie that we can put to rest, that we don't wait to be celebrated, because it says something. And it says something about the ways in which we claim space in this country. I want to go into the book here for a minute, because I think it directly ties in. In part 2 of the book, that's called "The Negro Digs Up His Past," based upon the Arthur Schomburg essay, "The Negro Digs Up His Past." Arthur Schomburg talks about how the Negro must, of course, remake their past in order to make their future. And in this chapter, you're laying out what does it mean to actually look for these Black historical moments to celebrate in everyday life. And you bring in these memory makers into the conversation. Can you take us through that and take us through understanding even the quote you put about if the past is another country, then I am its citizen, but that the past here is where we need to root ourselves, as Jimmy Baldwin said, right? The past is the present. Like we carry our past with us.
Yeah, thank you so much. All of the parts of the book are named after important texts in Black history that are both by historians, some are by poets, some are by writers, novelists and writers who are thinking historically about the work that they're doing. But that essay by Arturo Schomburg that is published in the New Negro Anthology is so important because it really offers some kind of philosophical groundings around the work that Black history is doing as a corrective to mainstream history, right? It's not only filling in gaps and saying, oh, they didn't include the name of this Black person, let's include that in the narrative. No, it's also, in digging up the past, it's saying something, it's both describing things that have been overlooked, but it's also correcting a lot of distortions about Black life as well. But it's doing so always with an eye towards the future, as we mentioned before, in this way in which it's digging up the past in order to kind of organize more effectively in the present moment and to make better sense of the world in which we live so that we can make this historically informed decisions about how to make something better, how to pursue something better. And so in the spirit of that, the Negro digs up his past and that work of thinking about Black memory work and also thinking about it as evolving, right? This is not just about preserving the tradition as is, but it's also thinking about what are things that we also have to try and improve about the way in which we engage in remembering the past. So that part of the book, I'm asking questions about where do we look to identify meaningful and important parts of Black history, right? We know so many people commemorate Black history by talking about the same figures over and over again, right? And only thinking about individuals of rare achievement, the first Black person to do this, that, and so on. And many of those lives are really important to study and they have important lessons, but it can be at the expense of the textured and nuanced realities of everyday Black people. Someone like myself who comes from only, working generations and generations of working class, Black folks in the kind of working, poor classes, right? What does it mean to offer a history to those folks as well, to understand that there are people and their experiences in history that we can study that are relevant to all of our lives when we think about the kind of diversity of Black experiences as well. And Woodson absolutely was someone who was thinking about this, right? When he writes about the workadays, right? Or the kind of the Negro wage earner, right? When he's talking about Black folks in the rural South and their experiences, or when he's writing about Black women domestic workers, right? So this part of the book is really turning to these everyday aspects of Black life that I wanted to take time and sit with, like a handwritten letter by a teacher named Ms. Mary Ross Jones when I was looking for examples of Black History Month and Negro History Week celebrations in Mississippi, where I was I found evidence of these and documentation of these early Black History and Negro History Week celebrations in Mississippi, but I also found, these handwritten letters by these ordinary Black teachers who were documenting things about their experience as they were trying to contest the inequities that they were living in. And in sitting with those stories, right, the things that she was detailing about having to operate a Black school in an overcrowded Black church and describing what that meant. Because I knew that Black schools operated out of Black churches, but I never really sat to think about what that meant for the day-to-day kind of Black teachers. And she talks about, for instance, when there are funerals, her and the students having to rearrange the sanctuary or the church to prepare for the homegoing ceremony of a community member, right? And to be able to kind of sit and think deeply about what that means, both for the teacher and for the students, like these are things that we also need to study during Black History Month so that we can make sense of how, the kind of the nuances of everyday Black people and to study them and to understand how they were striving to make meaningful experiences for themselves and to live meaningful lives despite the inequities that existed. And I think there's a lot of beauty in that story, even as it exposes also the structural inequalities that they were living under. And I wanted to write about familiar figures, but also wanted to write about everyday Black people as well, and to say that studying their histories is also something that has important lessons for us today.
And I want to ask the audience, as you're sitting here and you're listening to the ways in which Dr. Givens is laying down everyday history, if you have questions, drop them in the chat. I definitely will uplift them and bring you into this conversation. You mentioned Miss Jones. I was going to bring her up because I did underline something you wrote in the book, where you said that her account prompted you to consider the fact that a reckoning with death is always at the forefront of Black life. Now, you mentioned here, at this point, your mind ran away with itself. But so did mine, because I was thinking here about these moments of death that are cemented and seared into the Black experience. I think of my great-grandmother, because her father was shot dead by the KKK in the front door of our family home. I think about my grandmother, who remembers seeing that picture of Emmett Till on the cover of Jet magazine. I think about my mother, who remembers seeing the picture of Dr. King after he was shot on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. And then I think about seeing Mike Brown in the street, and how that was like a significant wrestling with death in front of our faces. Can you talk about that, and how even with death at the forefront, it's also backed up by moments of joy and love and laughter that we fight to keep in our community as well?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. And that letter by Mary Ross Jones, I came across that years ago, and I never found a way to work it into any of my writing, but it's always stuck with me as having to think about the relationship between the realities of Black death and dying, and this kind of unnatural relationship to it because of anti-Blackness in the world that we live in, and how Black people have had to organize, organize around that. So much of the Black freedom struggle is not just responding to just death, these kind of spectacle kind of death, but also the kind of slow death and dying that so many of our kind of ancestors were subjected to when we think about the period of enslavement and so on and so forth. But the way in which the necessity to kind of offer an account, and an honest account of those things, as a way of motivating the ongoing struggles for justice from one generation to the next, was really important, right? And when we think about so many scholars whose motivation and the urgency with which they're writing, right? That quote by Carter G. Woodson, "There would be no lynching if it did not start in the schoolroom," he's making that connection very clear, is that Black history is not just history for history's sake, but there's an urgency around it because it's responding to and it's trying to help us understand with more clarity what it is that we're up against, and to also inspire new generations to effectively organize against these kinds of injustices that we experience as communities. But also, so a lot of Black history has had to kind of document the kind of experiences of people that have been passed away because of the ways in which their lives were distorted, right? Whether that be the story of Nat Turner, right, that I talk about based on, that letter between Zora Neale Hurston and Du Bois, but I also talk about my own third grade teacher introducing me and my classmates to the story of Nat Turner because she felt like we weren't taking our preparation for Black History Month serious enough, and she kind of gives us this lecture. But I remember when I first started reading and analyzing textbooks written by Black school teachers from the late 19th century up until the time of Woodson, placing him in that tradition, and I saw how teacher after teacher, they spent so much time writing about the story of Nat Turner, and because they were working to kind of reclaim and tell his story in a more honest way, because he had been written off as demented and deluded in so many of the kind of mainstream historical accounts that did talk about him, right? So Black history has also been about, engaging in what Vincent Brown calls these kind of Black mortuary politics, working to restore honor and dignity to the dead, right? And history is a way that the living, right, we're thinking about our relationship to past generations, to past communities that have passed on. There's always a question about death and those who have passed on when it comes to thinking about history and our relationship to it. But that's been layered in all kinds of ways when we think about the realities of kind of death and dying and the killing of Black people that has motivated a lot of the historical movements that we have to document and write about in history as well. So I've tried to, in that essay, The Negro Digs Up His Past, to think through that relationship between Black folks working to imagine a new world through their work of recovering history, but also having to seriously reckon with some of the kind of complicated parts of our history, even though Black folks had to make kind of, meaningful cultural resources and meaningful lives in relationship to these kind of violent realities. And so and that means we have to be honest about that and talk about it in ways that's not dispiriting, because the tradition of Negro History Week and all of these additional resources like the poetry, the music, the kind of plays by people like Nannie Helen Burroughs that she wrote to expose this history, but also infuse it with the resistance and the resilience and the agency as also a part of the narrative, right? We have to be able to have a model of historical interpretation that holds those things in tandem.
It's radical to even think about the notion of imagining a different world. Like that is difficult for people. I mean, I think that is white supremacy when it's working best, right? Because there have been moments when white supremacy has not worked at its fullest extent. White supremacy works best when it takes away your ability to have a radical imagination for how things can be better. That you're thinking that all we have is what is in front of us. Your title, I'll Make Me a World, which of course is based upon that poem, is about challenging that white supremacist narrative that that knowledge production for Black people cannot be a form of liberation, cannot be a form of radical resistance. So can you talk about that? And as a second part to the question, I like to do a little bit of connective tissue between I'll Make Me a World and fugitive pedagogy, because, I've been looking at the long arm of your work, and it's just each piece is another connection kind of in this long role of education as a form of liberation and resistance.
Yeah, when I appreciate that point about when you say like the radical act about, thinking about the future and imagining beyond the confines of Jim Crow. I remember, and I appreciate a lot of the work on like Afrofuturism and all that sort of stuff right now. But, I've always understood the kind of Black studies tradition to always inherently be kind of a futuristic, project, especially when I think about the work of people like Carter G. Woodson and these teachers, because they're thinking about knowledge production, but they're always thinking about it with an eye towards the developmental needs of Black children and Black youth, right? So when they're thinking and people like James Weldon Johnson writing this, the language of I'll Make Me a World and inviting Black students to think about a world that doesn't exist, and they're doing it in very practical ways that, yes, are really radical. And some people are like, well, what do you mean by that? And I'm like, well, let's just take, for instance, the way in which Black teachers and educators approach civics and history education despite the restrictions imposed on them. And this is a part of that fugitive pedagogy tradition. It's like, how do we make sense of all of these teachers in the Jim Crow South teaching Black students about the importance of voting and the franchise, right? And teaching them about the period of Reconstruction and the kind of Reconstruction amendments and why it was important to kind of work to organize and reclaim that tradition. Right. And they're modeling it within the schools where students are modeling ideas of democracy, even within their schools in terms of voting, when the adults themselves are denied that privilege in the world around them. So they're teaching young people about the importance and the exercises of civic engagement, knowing that the world that they live in does not allow for them to kind of fully express their citizenship in these ways, because these are teachers who are training generations of leaders for a world that doesn't exist. So then when we get civil rights leaders who are coming and demanding particular things, right? People like, for instance, in the book I write about Martin Luther King Jr., people often talk about him as this adult, but in the book, I don't talk about him during the civil rights movement at all. I write about him as a high school student, writing a speech with the assistance of his high school English teacher, Miss Sarah Grace Bradley, entitled The Negro and the Constitution, where he's demonstrating his knowledge of Black history and the story of Black Reconstruction that Du Bois wrote, right? Just a decade before he's writing this speech in the 1940s, where he's demonstrating his ability to think critically about the Reconstruction period and why Black people have been, and why that was connected to Black civil rights struggles in the 20th century, because Black people continue to be denied, their kind of full civic rights, right, and their full rights as citizens. And he's applying this information that he's learning about Black history to make sense of that, right? So then when we get people like him or Angela Davis and so many other folks as civil rights and Black power leaders, it's like, well, they didn't just learn that out of nowhere. Yeah, they're working towards social transformation and to kind of demand and work towards the creation of a new world. But these are ideas and dreams of a new world that they're expressing through their leadership, through their organizing, that are coming to bloom, right, and blossoming. But the seeds were planted, decades and generations before. And this is what it means when we think about this world making and this kind of approach to Black history education as informing the kind of political, stakes of Black teachers' pedagogy, and that they have clarity about these things. Not just history teachers, but also English teachers, and also in all Black teachers in schools, because they understand their commitment to teaching new generations of Black children as beyond just subject matter expertise, right? It's not just about math or science, but it's about learning and kind of developing competency in these areas, but also becoming educated to put it in service and put it to use for some larger purpose, right? And that's something that's very, very clear when we read the records of folks like Woodson and all of these teachers who are putting Negro History Week into practice across the country, right? Because Woodson creates it, but it only has legs in a life because teachers like a woman named Tessie McGee in rural Louisiana,
picks it up.
or picks it up, right, and puts it into practice, and we have to take that seriously.
And we have to take seriously that it's not just one person that is putting the structure around, but it's the people who pick it up. It's the members of his fraternity, Omega Psi Phi. It's the college students at Kent State who pick it up and say, this is something that we're going to claim. It's the Black folks who moved back to Ghana that took Black History Month with them, and then they're practicing over on the continent. So I think it's understanding that you create something, but the legs that it grows are given by the community. I want to go back into the book, into the chapter When Truth Gets a Hearing, and you, which I really love that. But you talk about what does it mean when very vulnerable communities have to deal with things like the scrubbing of websites, banning of books, censoring of curricula, that if you're in an educated household, if you're in an educated community, they can ban books, but they're already on your shelf. They can change the curriculum, but you already have access to it. It's the communities that don't. The economically disadvantaged Black communities that lose the most when this happens. Can you talk about that and the importance of making sure that Black History Month is then celebrated intentionally in these communities?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That title, When Truth Gets a Hearing, is from the kind of this play that Nannie Helen Burroughs wrote, and that the students of the National Training School for Women and Girls that Burroughs founded in 1909, that they kind of toured various parts of the country, performing, where we see someone like Nannie Helen Burroughs, who built this institution for working class, overwhelmingly working class Black women and girls, with resources, especially from Black communities, right? With, and particularly the National Baptist Convention also supporting that work, but also lots of individual donations from Black communities, especially in Washington, D.C., and where she understood access to Black history being important for all people, not just people who might be seen as on a trajectory to becoming, pursuing advanced degrees, right? She's primarily working with Black women and girls who had limited opportunities. But she said, even, these women, right, who are sweeping floors and and taking care of other people's homes, right, are entitled to this information, because this history has to do with the way in which we come to understand ourselves. It's about our identity. It's about understanding our place and our value in the world, even if the world around us does not value us, right? And understanding that, and to be able to have a critical consciousness about those things. And she modeled that through her pedagogy. And this play that she wrote, that toured around the country, people like Du Bois, Alice Dunbar Nelson, Woodson wrote glowing reviews of it because they were so impressed with the way that she also participated in helping to preserve this knowledge in across the class sector in Black communities, with these plays that she wrote and that her students performed in such an excellent way. And I think that part is important because I try to emphasize what we might think of as the kind of broader enterprise of historical production and knowledge preservation, is that it's not only formally trained historians, it's not only, formally trained archivists that are the people that have helped to preserve these histories and maintain them over the years, right? And I tell the story about Nannie Helen Burroughs, who did all this work, and then many people for some time forgot about her, right? And then in the 1970s, with the emergence of Black women's history and Black women's studies, that kind of emerges in the reclamation of an expansion, even of the kind of the books about African American history to attend to gender and women's experiences with more intentionality, right? We get the reclamation of Nannie Helen Burroughs, not because Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham knew about her on her own, but because her mother, who was a school teacher, told her about that, told her about Nannie Helen Burroughs, and she was able to then go and look and seek out more information about her. And then now, because Nannie Helen Burroughs' papers were then preserved, new generations like myself, like other scholars, like, I think about other people who have written books about Nannie Helen Burroughs well after Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, are able to continue in that tradition. And I'm able to kind of take this unpublished play that Nannie Helen Burroughs wrote and have my students analyze it and read it and think about it. And that demonstrates this kind of the multiple hands that have gone into the labor of maintaining and preserving this tradition over the years. It's Nannie Helen Burroughs herself working directly with students, writing this play to express and to engage communities around knowledge, emerging knowledge about Black history. But it's also, someone's mother telling them about someone that people have forgotten about, but that we need to revisit and study and recover to learn what that person's life has to teach us, right? And then it's the ongoing preservation work for the constant studying, constant revision, right, that we have to maintain. And that's one of the things that I tried to emphasize in that story with Nannie Helen Burroughs, introducing her students, but also helping people understand the labor behind the scenes that goes into making this kind of historical knowledge sustainable.
I'm thinking here about the last chapter. Where do we go from here? Which I find that to be a bigger question than what the book wrestles with, because we are in this moment where we're trying to figure out, not just as a Black community, but as a society that tends to believe it's a democracy, but it is not. We're wrestling with that on a bigger sense. I dug up something that you said maybe a year or so ago. You were doing an interview and you were talking about bell hooks in the book Teaching to Transgress. And you used the quote that bell hooks has: for Black folks teaching up, education was always political because it was rooted in anti-racist struggle. I thought about that, and I thought about Audre Lorde, the Black poet who died of breast cancer, who wrote that the personal is always political. So before we get into where do we go from here, I want to have you frame I'll Make Me a World in a bigger, broader context in terms of what is happening now and why this book is so important to even help us understand what we're going through and potentially what coming out of it would look like.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. In this moment, lots of people are realizing that the things that we have taken for granted in, recent generations, and, my generation, even, generations, just before me, right, is that we've lived for some time where universities and colleges have African-American history courses, African-American studies departments where we've made lots of progress and when it comes to, national historic sites, right, and kind of and all these sort of things. And for a lot of people, it's really jarring now to see the literal removing of all these things. Whereas for folks like Woodson, they were having to build a lot of this stuff and create these institutions from the ground up. So I recognize the similarities between the kind of backlash and the containment of Black history and all this sort of stuff. But there is something distinct about this moment in that you have people who have never lived in a world when Black History Month did not exist. You have people who have never lived in a world where there was no such thing as Negro history, Black history, African-American studies departments, but they're seeing the active removal. They're seeing the videos of people removing the names of enslaved people from a historic site in Philadelphia, that communities organized to get those names put up at that historic site tied to, George Washington's home in Philadelphia. And I think this is a moment where people have to understand that what was politically at stake in the creation of these things to begin with is that it was never just about everyone developing encyclopedic knowledge about this every single Black person that ever lived and every single thing that they did, but it was understanding deeply about power, how power relations structure the way in which we see the world and the past, and ourselves within it, right? And that's what Negro History Week and Black History Month and Black history has been doing. It's critical history, right? It's calling out and it's helping to expose the way in which the kind of limitations of like the human society that we live in have been expressed also through the interpretations of the past and the knowledge systems that we have access to. And I'm hoping with this book to help people have deeper and more thoughtful conversations about what's happening in this moment. Because it's not just about people depriving us of information and the names of this particular story, right? It's about people trying to prevent us from gaining ground in a much larger moral war, right? There's something morally at stake in people having access to this information, especially Black communities, but all people, right? Because when we have a more fuller account of the past, right? Logically, when you study these things and we see the truth about what happened, logically, it leads to people making decisions about what needs to be done to correct certain injustices that is historically documented, right? To help us understand what structural inequality looks like, how it has been historically formed, right? And then, so some people who are trying to remove this information is not just because they don't want you to know it, right? Some of it is willful ignorance. They don't want to have to face it, but they also don't want people making decisions and acting with the full knowledge of what this history offers us, right? This is why we see this backlash to what was happening in 2020. This is why we've seen the backlash early on to Black Studies Department in efforts to contain what kinds of Black studies is included, is tolerable, so on and so forth. But that's what I'm trying to offer to this moment, is that it's much larger than just the facts and dates, right? And Negro History Week and Black History Month has always been about more than just being able to regurgitate information about encyclopedic knowledge about Black life. Knowing the details is important because we treated the Black people's lives are serious enough for us to carefully study it, right? And to be intentional in terms of how we're documenting it and how we're representing their experiences. But it's also about something larger, about power dynamics in the world that we live in and how that structures what we know about the past and what we can know about the world that we live in and ourselves.
And I think in your book, and folks, I highly recommend you getting the book as a pathway for going forward, but also as a way of helping young people to learn some of the names outside of like the big six we always talk about, right? Everybody knows Harriet Tubman, Martha King Jr., Frederick Douglass. And I would argue, though, and maybe you would agree with me, Dr. Gibbons, you actually don't know the story of Harriet Tubman. If all you know is that in your mind she was running away from everywhere and not really focused on male, then you don't know Harriet Tubman. You don't know what she did during the Civil War. You don't know even how she got her whole family up to New York and built her own community up there. So I'm telling people for Black History Month, and this is where I want to end, the thing I think people should do every day is learn one new Black fact. Like, you got to learn something new and then tell somebody, because we need more people as allies and less as enemies. Can you just, for us in last closing comment, Black History Month 2026, a century of Black history commemoration, what is one thing you think people should do every day outside of reading your book probably over and over again? What is one thing that people should do as they're celebrating this month?
Well, and one of the things that I talk about in the book is to think about a more action-oriented way of commemorating. One of the beautiful things that I write about, teachers is, by exposing the labor that goes into the preservation of something like Black History Month and the passing on of this tradition, is I was hoping to expose a lot of the work that people can also support, right? There's a need to support the active efforts to preserve community memory, community history, right? There's lots of work that's being done by Black archivists, community institutions, also ASALH, right? There's importance for contributing to the organizations that have preserved this legacy despite the kind of hostilities in the world that we live in. So we shouldn't just use Black History Month as a time to kind of tell good stories, eat good food, have a good time. It's like, but there is labor, there's things that you can do to actively contribute to the preservation of this legacy by supporting local efforts and national efforts and even international efforts around the preservation of knowledge about Black life, history, and culture, and to kind of continue the legacy of teaching this work for newer generations, right? And so that's something that I think should be done. Is that there are lots of work where we can invite and use our own agency to help participate in this tradition and participate in that labor.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jarvis Givens, Professor of Education in African and African American Studies and the co-founding faculty director of the Black Teacher Archive at Harvard University. His new book, I'll Make Me a World, the 100-Year Journey of Black History Month. It is very timely here on day 3 of Black History Month, but it also lays both a pathway for how do we, in this moment, as they say, history is not written by the young, it's written by those of us who are living forward and looking backward. And this book will help us to do the same. Thank you so much, Dr. Givens.
Thank you.
I want to bring Dr. Savoy back up to close it for us.
Thank you so much. What an amazing conversation. I'll Make Me a World. Black history does not survive because of institutions alone. It survives because people carry it. One of the things that you definitely made clear in moments of censorship, erasures, restricted access, is that communities that have always needed Black history the most are often the ones who lose first when it's taken away. And the work that you described, rooting Black history in everyday life, working in communities and classrooms and churches, fraternities and families, it's not just symbolic, it's protective, it's political, and most importantly, it's necessary. The book seems to insist that Black history education is not simply about remembering the past. It's really about, you're giving us a toolkit here. You're equipping people to understand themselves, to read the world critically, and to imagine something better, even when the world does not affirm their value. And so I would just simply like to close, and I want to say thank you so much, Dr. Givens, for this work and for reminding us whose labor makes history possible. Thank you to everyone here for being a part of a tradition that continues not because it is sanctioned, but because it is claimed. And this conversation doesn't just end today. It will continue to travel with us. I'll Make a World is available out now for you to purchase. Thank you to the Pratt Library, and we are super excited. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah,
Thank
you
you
so much for that. Yeah.